Welcome back to Tipping Point. I'm your host, Riley Lewis, filling in for Kara McKinney. It was a historic weekend for President Trump, filled with massive rallies and even an appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience for an interview that lasted nearly 3 hours, 2 hours and 58 minutes to be exact. They covered many different topics, ranging from his first term in office and the challenges that he faced and that he's learned from, to the current state of his re-election campaign, and it was refreshing to hear how sharp he was. Most importantly, their interview was entirely unscripted and unedited. Long-form interviews without notes or teleprompters or a timer ought to be standard for all political candidates, especially for those seeking the office of the presidency. But alas, these instances seem to be exceedingly rare. But in any case, it was a fascinating interview anyway, and both Rogan and Trump made some great points, starting with the truth about who Kamala Harris really is and about her radical policy agenda.
I tell people, because people are starting to get to know her, but she was defund the police. She was all these transgender operations. You know, if you wanted a sex change and you were in detention and you demanded a sex change, they would give you a sex change.
Well, the wildest one is this idea of giving free sex change to illegal immigrants.
That's right. In detention.
That is the wildest thing.
But she was,
is that the biggest problem you have?
Yeah.
You just walked here from Guatemala. You need to become a girl?
But she was in favor of it.
Yes.
So think of it. She changed. She changed 15 policies. In fact, I'm going to send her a MAGA cap.
She stole your idea about no tax for tips.
I came up with this idea that honestly nobody ever heard of. And now it took her 2 months, but you know what? All of a sudden,
It caught fire.
And she just put it into a little speech.
Yeah.
Well,
it became
but
popular.
I think we still have that issue. I think that issue is a good one for us.
It really goes to show just how fake her entire campaign is. She's ripped off multiple policy ideas from both Biden and Trump and pretended to have come up with them herself, I should say. But we can't let her get away with such antics, which ought to be disqualifying. It is a major red flag for her. And what's also a giant red flag are the endorsements that she has recently received from out-of-touch celebrities such as Beyonce and Eminem. There's no good reason to endorse her campaign, and anyone who does must want us to experience even more pain and suffering than we already have in the last few years, because that's what's in store. And anyone who's serious about saving America is firmly behind President Trump. Certainly, his time in office was not perfect, and there were issues. However, he's learned a lot from his mistakes, unlike Kamala, and he wasn't afraid to discuss those learned lessons with Joe Rogan.
One of the criticisms of your administration was with tax cuts and with tariffs, you increased the deficit. So
Yeah.
what was the strategy behind that? And did you think it was going to increase the deficit by a substantial amount?
Okay, we were ready to rock. It was all, I had a bad system. We had horrible tax policy. I made it great with a much lower tax rate. So I took it from almost 40% down to 21%. Now I'm bringing it from 21 down to 15, but only if you make your product in the United States, which is great. People call me, they said, what a great idea. Nobody ever heard of that before. I don't care if they make the product in Japan. Why should I give them? So it's at 21. At 21, in the first year, we took in much more revenue than we did at almost 40. Think of that. It inspired. Now, we had other things, too. We were able to get people to bring back their money. You couldn't bring back your money. If you had money in Europe, like Apple, Apple had many billions of dollars outside. They couldn't bring it. There was no way to bring it back in. The bureaucracy, the documents, the whole thing. And also the tax was too high. They wanted like half of it or something. Nobody's going to do that. So they leave their money in Japan and they spend their money there. That was part of what I did. The money came pouring back in. Apple took in hundreds of billions of dollars. They brought it back from overseas. They brought it in.
So how does the deficit increase because of that?
So what happened is this. We were ready to rock and roll, and then we had the COVID thing, and we had to focus on that. And if we didn't give some businesses a hand, you would have had a depression like in 1929.
He's absolutely right. We had to walk a tightrope in those early days of COVID-19. And while some mistakes were certainly made, President Trump handled the situation as well as anyone could have. Unless we're talking about Biden and Harris, of course, who made things much harder than they needed to be. They also pushed for unconstitutional vaccine mandates to boot, which led to a lot of pain for our fellow citizens, especially those who suffered adverse reactions to the vaccinations as a result. And the Biden-Harris administration also put Big Pharma and its profits above all else, including our God-given rights. And they've been trampling on those rights and freedoms ever since. Meanwhile, many people who raised concerns about how Biden and Harris were handling the pandemic online, including medical doctors, faced the wrath of government censorship. And now Kamala wants us to forget all about that censorship and give her even more political power. It is patently absurd, and we cannot let it happen. Joining us now to bring us the very latest campaign updates, courtesy of official Team Trump members, is Tommy Pigott, the Director of Strategic Communications for the Republican National Committee and the Editor-in-Chief of the Palm Beach Playbook. Tommy, thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me on.
So that was an epic interview with Joe Rogan on Friday. What do you make of that?
It really was. I mean, it was 3 hours long. We've seen tens of millions of views of that interview across different platforms. And I think the contrast to Kamala Harris is very telling. Kamala Harris could never sit for a 3-hour interview. She could barely sit for a 20-minute interview, and even those are completely edited. It just shows, like President Trump said in that interview, he said, I want to see Kamala Harris do something like this because she just can't. And someone that can't do a 3-hour-long interview like that should not be president. President Trump's not only done it with Joe Rogan, but he's done it with several other different interviewers as well, showing that he's speaking directly to the American people, can have in-depth conversations, not just on politics and issues, but about life, about his experiences, about culture. He's showing he's the president for all Americans, and he's speaking directly to the American people.
Yeah, absolutely he is. I'm glad you mentioned, of course, that we're not going to see this from Kamala Harris, who, I mean, Joe Rogan's studio was in Austin, Texas, right? She was in Houston with Beyonce on Friday at a campaign event, so we thought maybe she would show up because it's only a few hours of a drive, and still, even though she's right there in the Texas area, she still couldn't make time to do this interview. And like you said, it's because she can't. It's not about her busy schedule. It's not about the campaign heating up. It's not about tensions running hot. It's about ability here. That is what is on display right now. We have two very different candidates with two very different visions for America, who also have different skill sets and vastly different abilities. Trump, for his part, has spent his whole life in the private sector. He doesn't come from this world of politics or the bubble in Washington, D.C., and he doesn't come from this world of needing debate coaches and spending all this time doing prep. He just sat down for an interview, no notes, no teleprompter, no timer, and just started talking about everything. UFC, his first term in office, foreign policy, literally everything and anything. Nothing is off limits with President Trump. He's just that available. With Kamala Harris, it's all fake. It's astroturfed. It's scripted. And now we're seeing the Polymarket poll today. Trump is way up over Kamala Harris. So I want to ask you, what do you think? I mean, do you think that this is a big moment for Trump in terms of continuing to build that momentum?
Well, he's had a historic campaign throughout this entire campaign. This last weekend was especially so, though. Press conference at the border, Joe Rogan podcast, yes. Madison Square Garden. People are calling it MAGA Square Garden now after that rally in New York. I mean, historic events going from Texas to deep blue New York, going everywhere and talking to everyone. And the enthusiasm for his campaign really cannot be matched. The fact that not only did he sell out, in a sense, Madison Square Garden, there were tens of thousands of people outside as well in deep blue New York. That just shows that he doesn't need to lie about Beyonce performing at his rallies to have people show up like Kamala Harris did, which, by the way, strikes me as very weird. She said, or her campaign at least heavily implied to news media, that Beyonce was going to perform at her rally in Texas. They also said Beyonce was going to perform at the DNC. They lied twice. It's just a very weird campaign over there. I don't quite understand what they're doing. So President Trump, again, showing up, selling out Madison Square Garden, not only once, could have done it multiple times, showing the enthusiasm and the momentums with President Trump.
Yeah, well, and it's just interesting, too, because Democrats for the last few weeks have been accusing President Trump of hiding. They say he's not doing interviews, and he won't go and sit down with 60 Minutes, and he's not doing enough. He's hiding from the American people. Beg to differ strongly, because he was at Madison Square Garden in front of 20,000 people, and there were at least 10,000 people outside waiting to hear him, but some people said that number could have been as high as 20,000, 30,000, maybe even 40,000. So quite the opposite, actually. He's putting himself into situations where he might be behind hostile territory. Nothing's guaranteed. He's had 2 assassination attempts on his life, and he's still this bold and this brazen, and he's doing everything he can, morning, noon, and night, 7 days a week. He mentioned on Joe Rogan's show that he hasn't had a day off in nearly 60 days. Kamala Harris is taking a day off this weekend, but Donald Trump, he hasn't had a day off in nearly 60 days. That's not somebody who's hiding from the American people. That's not somebody who's overworked by the demands of this campaign. So, you know, we're coming out of break here. We're running out of time, but I want to ask you, do you think Kamala Harris has any redeeming pitch whatsoever? Because Donald Trump, he's going out and he's making his case for the American people, but all she can do is call him a fascist. So do you think her campaign is officially falling apart?
I think it is. She's clearly desperate. I mean, the closing argument of President Trump is Kamala Harris broke it and President Trump will fix it. Very clear, very direct, and backed up by the facts.
Yes.
Kamala Harris's closing argument is Beyonce may or may not sing at my rally, and then she doesn't end up singing. I mean, I don't really know what her closing argument is from Kamala Harris. So she has no closing argument at all. Her policies are a failure. Her record's a failure, and she's incredibly far left. So she has no closing argument. President Trump's is clear, direct, and speaking to the American people. No matter if they're from a blue state, a red state, a purple state, Americans want common sense back in the White House. They want President Trump to fix these crises that Kamala Harris created. He has the plan to do it.
Yes, and we know that he can, of course. So, make sure that you have your plan to vote. I've already cast my ballot, but if you haven't already, make sure you get out there, vote, vote, vote. Bring your friends, your family, your coworkers, anybody who's eligible. We have to save this country together, and we can do it with President Trump back in the White House. So, Tommy, thank you as always for stopping by. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.